The desert at night is nothing like the desert by day. The silence feels endless, stretching out across the sand like a heavy blanket, broken only by the hiss of wind moving between the rocks. The stars above are so sharp, so endless, it almost hurts to look at them. And beneath their pale light, the trails twist and vanish into places no map remembers. I was walking there once, following a path lit only by my flashlight. The beam cut across broken stone, catching on cacti and rusted wire half buried in sand. Every step echoed louder than it should have, as if the ground was hollow beneath me. And then I noticed the shadows. Not mine, not cast by the rocks. They were too tall, too thin, moving in ways the wind couldn't explain. At first, I thought they were tricks of the light, shapes pulled from the edges of my vision. But they moved when I stopped, leaning closer with every step I took. I should have turned back. I should have left that trail alone. But instead, I kept walking. And that's when I saw it. The desert stretched wide and empty beneath the pale light of the moon. Cool air whispered across the sand, brushing my skin. I could taste a faint grit on my lips, dry and metallic. My footsteps pressed into the trail, soft, careful. Each step seemed louder than the last. I was alone, but the air carried a strange hum. Shadows gathered around the edges of the path. At first, I thought they were rocks. But when I slowed, they did not match the shapes on the ground. The shadows stretched, longer than they should. I froze, and they stretched farther still. A wind moved through the cacti, rustling needles. But the shadows did not tremble. They remained, bending across the trail like dark water. I took a cautious step forward, one foot in front of the other. The shadow leaned with me, as though curious, as though alive. The moonlight felt colder now. It made the sand sparkle faintly, but the shadows drank it in, leaving a dark smear behind them. I listened. The desert was silent, yet heavy. A soft scratching came from somewhere close, or maybe from nowhere at all. Each step I took made the shadows grow. I felt them brushing against my ankles, light, almost teasing, then suddenly more insistent, like fingers curling. I stopped, held my breath. The air smelled of dry earth, distant sage, and something faintly burnt. The trail seemed longer than it had before. The moon hung low and bloated, and the shadows moved without wind, without shape to explain their motion. I wondered if I was imagining it. I wanted to blink, to close my eyes, but every blink made the shadow closer, leaning across my shoes. A stillness pressed in. My heartbeat felt loud, echoing inside my skull. The sand shifted slightly beneath me, though no one moved. I tried to step backward. The shadow followed, stretching, growing. It slid along the sand with a fluid patience. The night smelled warmer now, smoke or something like it, but there was no fire, only the trail, my footprints, and the dark that clung to them. I remembered the shape of stones near the path, but nothing cast this shadow. Nothing in the desert had the right edges, the right angles, the right length. I looked down. It was thin, dark, solid, yet trembling as if it had a pulse. It reached for me without hands, without form, and touched my shoes, cold and insistent. I wanted to move, but the ground beneath felt different, heavier, as though it remembered my steps and held them for itself. The silence shifted. A faint rustling, almost like whispers, rose from the sand, circling me. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my throat was dry, and the words scattered inside. The shadows stretched once more. I could see them, long and thin, wrapping around the moonlight, stitching the trail into darkness. I tried to breathe. The air was still, but it pressed against my chest. Sticky, almost liquid. The trail ahead disappeared into a pale fog. I could see nothing beyond my feet, and even the moon seemed dimmer, hiding behind a veil. The shadow leaned again. I felt its weight, its curiosity, its silent patience. I stepped forward slowly. The sand crunched under my feet. The shadow moved with me, folding over the ground, a dark mirror that had no source. For a moment, I thought it might leave, but it did not. It lingered, like smoke refusing to rise. The desert held its breath. The trail faded, and the moon dipped behind a pale cloud. I was alone, yet surrounded. I stopped at the edge of the fog. The shadow pressed close, warm in a way that made no sense, cold in a way that felt alive. I stayed there, watching the faint light shiver across the sand, listening to the silence, listening to the shadow that clung to me, listening to my own breath echoing back like it had been borrowed. And then I walked on, slowly, carefully, knowing it would always follow, just beside my shoes, stretching long across the trail and waiting. The highway stretched empty beneath a gray, low sky. A wind rose to the cracked asphalt, carrying dust and the faint tang of gasoline. I was alone, the horizon flat and silent, stretching forever. Then I saw it, a flickering sign, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. The letters were half dead, pale light jumping between gaps, casting shadows across the sand-strewn lot. I slowed, the tires crunching softly on gravel. The building looked small, hollow, abandoned. Windows coated with dirt reflected a warped, pale moonlight. I stepped out. The air smelled of old metal, dust, and something sweet, almost like rusted sugar left too long in the sun. My shoes pressed into footprints that were not mine. They were fresh, trailing across the dust in crooked, careful paths. They moved toward the counter, toward the dark inside the building. I pushed the door. It gave with a low creak that lingered, stretching into the empty space. Inside, the shelves were bare. Dust lay thick but disturbed. Footprints crisscrossed the floor, some fading, some bold. The air was heavy. Static seemed to hum behind my ears. Light flickered from a broken bulb overhead, painting walls in pale, jittering strokes. At the counter, I froze. A shadow lingered there. It shifted slightly, though no one stood behind the glass. It moved like it breathed, rising, falling, waiting. I leaned closer. The shadow did not belong. No body, no form, just a dark smear that hunched against the pale light. It slid along the counter as if alive, and then, with a slow patience, it tilted toward me. The silence pressed against my chest. I could feel the dust in my throat. The air smelled warmer here, like old paper in the faint, bitter tang of decay. I stepped back. Footsteps echoed softly against concrete. Or maybe they were mine, bouncing off the walls, making the space feel twice as large, twice as empty. The shelves creaked in the draft. I wanted to touch them, but the wood felt brittle, like it might crumble under the slightest pressure. And the shadow remained, unmoving, yet moving, stretching toward the corners, following the rhythm of my breath. The doorway to the back room opened a little. I did not see a hand, a figure, anything, but the air shifted there. Cool, dry whispering. I imagined movement, slow, deliberate, like something watching, waiting for me to notice. I walked forward slowly. The footprints led me in loops around the counter. Some stopped abruptly. Others continued. No pattern, no logic, just careful wandering across the dusty floor. I could almost hear it breathing. Soft, deep, shifting slightly, as though it existed only because I was looking. It wasn't angry. It wasn't playful. It was aware. I leaned against the counter. The shadow leaned too, cold and soft, like a wet cloth left to dry in the dark. I felt its presence touch my hand, but there was nothing there. Outside, the sign flickered again, pale letters flashing against the gray night. The wind moved, bringing the scent of sand and distant rain, and the shadow stayed, waiting where it had always been, even as I turned and left. The door groaned behind me. Footsteps mine, crunch against the gravel. The lot was empty. The air smelled cleaner here, but I could feel the trace of it clinging to my skin, the quiet weight of being observed, and the memory of footprints crossing dust that belonged to no one. I walked back to the highway. The flickering sign dimmed as I left, the building shrinking in the rear view. But I knew it lingered, waiting, silent, waiting for someone to step inside again, to notice the footprints, to see the shadow that moved without a body, to feel the cold, patient hush of something that belonged to the abandoned. And I walked on, quietly, carefully, listening to my own breath mixing with the desert wind, aware that some places remember even after they are gone. The dunes lay quiet beneath a pale, slivered moon. Cold wind sifted across the sand, brushing my face. I could taste salt and dust, lingering on my lips. My tent shivered softly in the night. I lay on a thin mat, listening to the desert breathe. The air smelled faintly of dry grass and distant sea. Then I heard it. Soft steps circling the canvas walls. Slow, deliberate, careful. I held my breath. The sand shifted under invisible weight. The steps traced curves around the tent, pausing, retreating, returning like a whisper I could not catch. I unzipped the flap. The cool air rushed in. Sand stretched smooth and untouched. No footprints. I stepped out. The night pressed against me, still and wide. The wind rustled, carrying grit that stung my eyes. The dunes held only silence and my own footprints. Back inside, the steps resumed, circling, patient. I could feel them through the thin fabric, a shadowed rhythm echoing against my ribs. I unzipped again. The sand remained flawless. Yet one set of prints lay heavy, deep, stopping at the tent's entrance, perfectly still, waiting. My fingers brushed the sand. Cool, dry, yet dense with presence. I imagined a figure just beyond, bent in shadow, watching. The wind picked up, carrying static through the tent. A faint rustle along the ridge of dunes, like someone or something, running hands along the earth. Or maybe it was my own pulse, loud and jagged in the stillness. I sat, leaning against the tent pole. The footprints were impossible. No other tracks connected to them. No pattern, no path. Just one set, frozen in place. Like a reminder, I pressed my hand against the canvas. It trembled slightly. I could hear the sand move beyond, small shifts, deliberate pauses, then silent again. The moonlight painted faint stripes across the tent floor. The shadow of a dune flickered like a heartbeat. Every time I blinked, the prints seemed closer, closer to the edge of the canvas, closer to me. I unzipped once more. The air smelled of cold sand and something faintly burnt. The footprint remained. No sign of anything else. No path to explain it. I crouched, traced the impression with a finger. Deep, heavy, unnaturally exact. The sand held the shape perfectly, even the faint indent of toes. But no one had walked there. A gust lifted the edges of the tent. The canvas brushed my cheek. The desert exhaled around me. I felt the presence of the steps in my chest, like shadows had weight. I lay back, tried to listen through the thin fabric. Soft footsteps paused, then circled again. Slower this time, deliberate, almost patient, always returning to the entrance. The moon sank behind a dune. Darkness pooled in the curves of the sand. The prints stayed, heavy in their emptiness, an anchor in a sea of night. I could feel a pulse, not my own, a quiet insistence beneath the earth. Every exhale I took stirred the sand lightly. Every inhale made the presence tighten, waiting for me to notice. Hours passed. The wind hummed. I imagined movement beyond my vision, the slow, circular rhythm of something unseen, circling, observing, just beyond the thin tent wall. I unzipped the flap one last time. The deep print still rested there, perfectly still, unclaimed, a silent warning carved into sand. I breathed in the night air, cold, sharp, and slightly metallic. The dunes swayed under a gentle wind, but nothing else moved, only the footprints. I lay back, tracing their pattern in my mind, imagining them circling endlessly, stopping only at the entrance, waiting. And I slept lightly, half in dream, half in wakefulness, with a memory of heavy steps pressing against the edge of the canvas, the weight of presence I could not see, and the quiet dread that some things move without leaving a path. The road stretched into darkness beneath a pale, frozen moon. Warm air from the desert pressed against the windows. The tires hummed over cracked asphalt, soft and endless. Hours had passed since I'd seen another car. No headlights, no tail lights, nothing but my own movement. The hum of the engine felt louder than it should, like the desert was listening. The horizon held nothing. Flat dunes rolled faintly under starlight. Wind lifted small clouds of dust, brushing my cheeks, stinging my eyes, filling my nose with dry grit. I slowed, pulled to the side. The asphalt shimmered under pale moonlight. Nothing moved, nothing but shadows stretching across the road. Then, far ahead, faint headlights flickered, soft, orange, hesitant. I watched as they approached slowly, and then they vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness itself. I gripped the wheel. The air inside felt heavier, thicker, scented with hot metal and the faint taste of burnt rubber. I blinked. The road stayed empty. Shadows shifted along the edges of the asphalt. They moved without bodies, sliding slowly across the surface. Long, thin, almost liquid. I leaned closer to the window, could feel them brushing against the tires. But nothing touched me. The desert wind rose, carrying a faint static hum. It pressed in through the vents, tickling my ears, crawling along my arms. I turned the radio dial. Nothing but silence. I started driving again. Slow, deliberate. The headlights of my car cut pale streaks into the dark. The road seemed longer, emptier. The dunes curling against the sky, like frozen waves in a black sea. I imagined the vanished headlights returning, closer this time, and then fading before they reached me, leaving only the long stretch of lonely asphalt. The shadows kept pace, dancing across the lines, stretching as I moved, folding over the road in silent patterns. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes in them, bending just beyond recognition. I stopped again. Footsteps of wind shifted sand along the roadside. I opened the window. The desert smelled cold and metallic, like dry stone under a frozen sky. The hum persisted, soft, constant, like a breath that did not belong to me. No cars appeared. No movement beyond the shifting shadows. Just a long, empty highway and the slow rhythm of my own pulse. I watched the horizon. The faint glimmer of lights teased the edges of vision. I blinked, and they were gone. Only the shadows moved, sliding, stretching, patient. I put the car in gear, moved forward slowly. The tires whispered over cracks. The wind lifted grit into my face. The night held me, and only me. I thought about turning back, but the road behind looked the same. Empty, shadows clinging to the asphalt, trailing in patterns I could not follow. The desert breathed, cold, dry, patient. I could feel it pressing against my shoulders, against the small pulse of my own heartbeat. The shadows leaned with me, folding into the light, watching, moving without reason. I kept driving, slowly. Every mile felt longer. The moon dipped slightly, casting pale silver stripes over the endless asphalt. The shadows stretched across them, like dark water, like they belonged more to the night than anything I could touch. Hours would pass, or maybe minutes. Time held no shape here. Only the road, the hum, the soft brushing of wind, and the shadows that moved without bodies, sliding across the highway without cars. And I drove on, alone, the desert folding silently around me, the asphalt long and empty, and the shadows always with me, just beyond the edges of the headlights, patient, waiting. The canyon walls rose sharply on either side. Reddish stone, rough under my fingers, glowed faintly in the pale morning light. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and distant sage. Wind threaded through the narrow crevices. At first, it was just a hum, soft, constant, brushing against my ears. It rustled loose sand along the ledges, whipped at my hair, ticked along my skin like tiny fingers. I paused. The sound shifted. It became something sharper, as though the wind were forming shapes. Curves of sound, edges of something alive. My name, whispered, curling over the stone. Soft, distant. I held my breath, listening, wondering if the canyon had learned it. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, dark streaks, shifting across cracks in the walls. They never approached, never fully revealed themselves, but I could feel their motion darting like smoke just beyond the light. The air felt heavier now. Each inhale carried grit, the tang of iron and dust, and something faintly sweet I could not place. It made my skin tingle, made my pulse rise without reason. I stepped forward slowly. Each footfall pressed into fine sand, tiny grains clinging to my shoes, catching in the ridges of my socks. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, folding sound into itself, bending it toward me. The whistling returned, sharper now, a trill of tones that curled into words, calling me, drawing me, soft, patient. I could almost respond, almost move closer, but I stayed, hesitant, afraid to break the fragile silence. Shadows twisted along the rock, a jagged line of dark, folding around a crevice, sliding across the canyon floor. They were too quick to follow, too distant to touch, but persistent, always at the edge of my sight. I pressed my hand against a stone wall. Cool, rough, solid. It steadied me. The wind carried a static hum now, threading between the voices, making them feel more urgent, more alive. I crouched to examine a small alcove. Dust had settled in thin layers, but the wind, or something else, stirred it. A faint rustle, a soft shuffle. I felt the presence without seeing it. The canyon seemed to pulse around me. Time stretched thin, breaths lingering in the cold air, echoing back like a distant heartbeat. The whistling shaped itself into my name again, sliding along walls, folding over stones, folding over me. I took another step. Shadows shifted, folding into cracks, stretching across ledges and steps, hovering between rock and light. I could feel them watching, curious, cautious, never close enough to reach, never far enough to ignore. The wind carried more than sound now. Hints of smoke or dry pine. The faint metallic edge of sand stirred in hidden corners. It whispered around my ankles, tickled my ears, and tugged at the hem of my shirt. I stopped. The shadows lingered. The voices receded, becoming almost musical, a soft echo that curled along the walls. I held my breath, letting the canyon speak, letting it fold the wind into shapes I could feel more than hear. The sun lowered slightly, casting pale gold along the stone. Shadows lengthened and bent, twisting across the sand and ledges. They did not move toward me. They did not retreat. They simply existed alongside me, alongside the whistling patient, watching. I traced the edge of shadow with my finger. It felt like cool silk, solid and soft at once. The wind carried my name one last time, lingering in the empty spaces between stone. I stepped back. The canyon seemed to exhale. The shadows melted into the light. The whistling softened into the hum of the wind. I felt a weight leave my shoulders, but the memory remained, the pulse of presence just at the edge of knowing. I walked slowly away. Each step pressed into the sand, leaving traces that would vanish with the wind. The canyon remained. Shadows and voices folded into itself, silent yet alive. And I carried their echo with every quiet step I took, wondering if they had ever stopped calling. The trail curled upward beneath the pale dawn. Rocks scraped against my boots. The air smelled dry, faintly metallic, carrying the last chill of night. I walked alone. Wind sifted through the scrub, rustling dry leaves and loose sand. The horizon stretched wide, empty yet alive. Then I saw it, a tall figure on the ridge. Still, no movement, no hint that it breathed. I paused, my chest pressed tight. The sun was just touching the edges of the valley, casting a soft glow that made shadows bend and lengthen. Its shadow stretched down the slope, thin, rigid, impossibly long. It moved with the curve of the sun, but the figure itself remained fixed like a carved shape in stone. I stepped closer. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, and the scent of sun-warmed rock rose in the air. I squinted, trying to measure distance, to see if it was real or just a trick of morning light. Hours passed. I circled, climbed, rested. The figure never shifted. Even as clouds drifted across the sun, its shadow remained stretched across the valley floor. I tried to look away. The landscape carried its presence, folding the valley around it. Even wind seemed hesitant near the ridge, lifting only small grains of sand, leaving the figure untouched. The light changed. Reddish tones washed over the rocks. Shadows deepened along crevices and ledges. Yet the figure stayed, a black silhouette, tall and patient. I breathed in slowly. The smell of dust and dry leaves filled my lungs. The wind whispered through sparse trees, soughing gently, but it could not move the figure. I walked to a lower ledge. From here, the shadow stretched even farther. It fell over rocks, sand, and scattered scrub. It moved only as the sun moved, but the figure itself remained frozen. I squatted to touch the stone beneath me. Warm, rough, solid. My hand shook slightly. The air seemed thicker, heavier, like something was pressing against the back of my neck. I raised my gaze. The figure did not flinch. The ridge was empty, but not empty. Something watched through the space it occupied. Through the valley it shadowed. Time folded quietly. Clouds drifted. I tried to move around it, but the shadow followed, stretching across the valley, linking the figure to every angle of light. I felt a hum in the air. Subtle, low, almost imperceptible. It threaded through the rocks, through my boots, through the dry wind brushing my face. I wanted to speak, but words caught in my throat. I sat on a boulder. The shadow softened slightly as the sun rose higher, but the figure did not move. It was still, patient, monumental. I could feel the weight of it pressing across the valley, folding the air into its presence. I traced the outline of rocks with my fingertips. Dust crumbled under my nails. The ridge seemed quieter than before, yet the stillness carried its own sound, soft, subtle, impossible to name. Even as morning came fully, the figure remained. Its shadow stretched across every dip, every dune, every ledge. I could see it from above, from below, and everywhere in between. It was always there, always patient. I rose slowly. My boots pressed into gravel and sand. The ridge smelled of stone and wind, and the faint trace of pine. The shadow followed every small step I took, sliding with the curve of light, anchored to a shape that would never move. I looked one last time. The figure had not changed. Its presence remained, silent, timeless, and awe held me frozen in place. As I finally stepped away, leaving its shadow stretching across the valley floor, still waiting, still patient, still impossible to forget. The highway curved gently beneath a pale night sky. A soft wind carried dust and dry grass across the asphalt. I spotted the motel just ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly, humming faintly in the dark. I pulled into the lot. Tires pressed gravel into the ground. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and old metal, and something faintly sweet, like mildew warmed by the night. The building was small, one long line of rooms. Every door stood open, beds unmade, sheets twisted, pillows tossed. It was as if the guests had vanished mid-motion, leaving only their traces behind. The lights above the doors hummed softly, pale orange buzzing that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I stepped out, boots crunching against gravel. The hum settled into my chest. I walked down the corridor. Dust shifted underfoot. A dry smell of linen and time lingered. Each room I passed looked the same, abandoned, yet alive in a quiet, uneasy way. Then I saw it. In the mirror of the farthest room, a dark shape flickered past. No one stood behind it. No movement in the doorway. Just a shape sliding along the glass. I froze. The air felt heavier, warmer, pressing against my skin. The hum of the lights threaded into my ears, layered over the faint creak of loose boards underfoot. I stepped closer to the mirror. Nothing moved behind it, yet the shadow lingered for a heartbeat longer than possible, folding into the reflection, folding into the room itself. I traced the edge of the bedspread. Rough linen, cool from the night. Dust rose in tiny motes, dancing in the flickering light. I breathed slowly, tasting the faint metallic tang of the air. The hallway stretched endlessly. I tried another door. The same. Unmade bed, empty room, mirror reflecting only stillness. But each time I looked, the shape appeared again, never the same, never far, never fully present. The wind shifted outside. It carried the scent of dry earth and the faint hum of passing cars that were nowhere in sight. The motel seemed to exhale, pulling the air with it, folding the light and the shadows together. I moved slowly back down the corridor, feet pressing against splintered boards. The hum lingered, steady, constant. Each mirror flickered, a dark ripple across the glass, a presence that knew I was watching, that waited in silence. I opened a door near the end. Sheets twisted like they had been tossed moments ago. A pillow leaned against the wall, as though someone had just stood and left. But no one had been there, only the echo of shape, folding in corners of vision. The ceiling fan above groaned softly. Dust swirled in lazy circles. I pressed a hand to the wall, cool plaster, rough under my fingers. The shadow flickered again in the mirror. I couldn't place it. It didn't belong. And yet it did. I stepped outside. Gravel pressed under my boots. The neon sign hummed and flickered, casting pale light across the empty lot. Windows stared back, dark and quiet, folding the motel into the night. I looked once more at the doors. Empty, open, unmade. The shadows were gone, or perhaps hidden. The air carried only the hum, the wind, and the faint, lingering scent of linen and dust. I walked to my car. The night pressed close, and the building seemed to breathe with me, watching, patient. Every step away felt slow, deliberate. The lights hummed behind me, casting shadows that moved slightly with the wind. I started the engine. The gravel whispered under the tires. The neon flickered one last time, inside the mirrors. I thought I saw a trace of that dark shape, just for a second, folded into the reflection of night. And then it was gone. Only the motel remained buzzing silent, alive in its own quiet way, waiting for the next footsteps to press against the gravel and the next eyes to meet its shadows. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a black sky. Sand shifted softly under my boots, cool and dry against my ankles. The air smelled faintly of stone and distant smoke. A dim light flickered on the horizon, swaying gently, like a lantern suspended in the wind. I stopped, blinking. I thought it might vanish if I stared too long. I started walking toward it. Each step pressed into soft sand, leaving faint prints that the wind threatened to erase. The light remained the same distance away, tiny and steady, swaying in the dark. I walked faster. The wind lifted loose grains into my face, dry, scratching, carrying the faint scent of iron. The lantern did not draw closer. It floated on the horizon, patient, watching. I paused. Breath curled in the cold night air. Stars reflected faintly off the sand. But the light stayed, swelling and shrinking slightly, like it had its own pulse. I moved again, soft footsteps crunching against shifting dunes. The lantern swayed. I imagined it shifting in response to me, yet every time I sped up, it remained stubbornly distant. A faint hum rose with the wind, not loud, not intrusive, but present. It threaded through the grains of sand, through the press of air against my skin, through the quiet rhythm of my own heartbeat. I thought about turning back, but the lantern drew my eyes. Curiosity mingled with unease. The desert felt alive, folding around me, holding me in its stillness. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning beneath the pale sweep of stars. The lantern did not change, did not dim, did not shift. It simply waited. I stepped onto a ridge. The wind rose, lifting dust and whispering through dry brush. I could feel it brushing across my face, gripping the loose ends of my hair. The lantern glowed, soft, and for a moment, I thought I saw shapes dancing around it, flickers of shadow that disappeared the moment I focused. I pressed a hand to sand. Cool, rough course. The prints of my passage blurred beneath shifting grains. The desert seemed to breathe, or perhaps it was my own pulse, sinking with a sway of light far ahead. I continued. The horizon stretched further than I thought possible. Each step fell heavier, though the sand remained the same underfoot. The lantern remained distant, a gentle sway against an infinite sky. Then it vanished, a sudden blink. The stars seemed to dim with it, the night becoming quieter, emptier, like the desert itself had closed its eyes. I stopped. The wind whispered along the dunes, but it carried no hum, no shadow, no light, only the cool, dry air pressing against my skin, holding me in that quiet absence. I turned in every direction. Nothing moved, nothing glowed. The horizon stretched flat, empty, and the sand beneath my feet held only my own prints, soon to be scattered by the desert wind. I sank to the ground. Fingers pressed into coarse grains. The cold seeped through my palms, grounding me in the quiet vastness. I breathed slowly, tasting dust and iron, feeling the emptiness around me. The lantern had left, but its sway lingered in memory, in the rhythm of my breath, in the hum of the wind that seemed quieter now, as though the desert had folded itself in half, hiding its pulse, watching, waiting. I lay back in the sand. Stars reflected faintly off scattered grains. My prints blurred under the soft shuffled wind. The night was still, the horizon empty, and I felt the pull of that lantern, far away, beyond reach, a quiet, patient light that might always remain just out of step, forever swaying on the edge of vision. The desert lay still beneath a pale, silver moon. Sand shifted faintly in the cool night air. I walked toward the tracks, each step pressing into dry gravel. The wind carried dust in a faint metallic tang, brushing my face. I stopped at the rails. They stretched into darkness, endless and quiet. The air smelled of ozone and scorched metal. A low hum vibrated beneath my feet. It felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a distant horn, long, mournful, threading through the night. It echoed across the dunes. I thought I saw the faint glint of light along the tracks, but it vanished before I could focus. I waited. The gravel whispered under my boots. Shadows shifted along the rails, thin and wavering. They stretched like black water across steel, bending with the vibration of the horn. But the train never came. I pressed a hand against the cold metal. Cool, smooth, steady beneath my fingers. The vibration thrummed through my palm, through my arm, through my chest. I could feel the echo moving beneath me, alive yet impossible to catch. The horn sounded again, farther, closer, then fading into silence. Shadows stretched longer, folding across the desert floor. They twisted with the rhythm of the unseen train, sliding across the tracks like smoke. I stepped onto the ties, wood pressed uneven beneath my boots. Dust rose, drifting along the rails. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of oil and sand. I imagined wheels rolling, rusted metal grinding, but nothing came. The horizon held no light, no approaching engine, only the faint shimmer of heat and shadow. Every time I strained my eyes, the shadows seemed closer, pressing along the rails, patient, deliberate. I crouched, fingers tracing grooves in the ties. A soft static hummed in the air, threading into the echo of the horn. It pressed against my ears, against the back of my neck, like something unseen moving beside me. The moon slipped behind a cloud. Darkness pooled between the rails. I could see only shapes, faint, vibrating, folding along the tracks, stretching impossibly long. I wanted to run, but my feet felt heavy, rooted in gravel and dust. The horn called again, soft, patient, a sound that knew my pulse, folding into my chest, then fading into silence. I rose slowly. The wind brushed across the tracks, stirring loose sand, lifting faint wisps against my legs. The shadows moved with it, sliding along the rails, folding over the ties, stretching as far as the eye could see. I pressed my face close to the steel. The cool metal held the hum, the vibration of something impossible. I tasted dust and iron on my tongue, felt it pressing through the soles of my boots. Every sense aligned to the same silent dread. The train would never come. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The horn repeated, fading and returning, the shadows stretching and folding, but the rails remained empty. I walked slowly along the ties. Gravel crunched underfoot. Every step stirred the desert, yet nothing moved beyond the faint vibration, the hum threading through the earth. The shadows followed, sliding, patient, alive in their absence. I stopped at a switch, cold steel under my hand. The desert air pressed against my skin, dry, metallic, almost sweet. The horn sounded one last time, soft, fading, folding into the stillness. I turned away from the tracks. The shadows still clung to the rails, stretching endlessly into the night. The wind whispered across the desert, dust lifting, grains brushing my face, and the hum persisted, soft, vibrating beneath my feet, beneath the air itself. I walked back slowly. Every step left prints in the sand. I did not look back, but I could feel the rails, the shadows, the silent insistence of the train that would never arrive. And it followed me in memory, in the pulse of the desert, stretching across the horizon, patient, watching, never stopping. The trail wound through low hills, dry brush brushing against my legs. The sky was pale with early night, cool air pressing against my skin. The scent of dust and stone carried faintly on the wind. Ahead, a shack appeared, alone, weathered wood and crooked boards. A single square window faced the trail. I slowed. The grass whispered beneath my boots. The air felt heavier near the shack, as if it exhaled in small, measured pulses. I stepped closer. The window glass was black, not reflective, not shiny. It held nothing, no stars, no moonlight, no shape, just black. I pressed my palm against the weathered wood. Cool, rough, grainy. The night pressed closer, quiet but expectant. A faint tapping sounded. From inside, slow, irregular. Light fingers drumming against the pane, soft, persistent. I held my breath. The wind stopped. Even the rustle of brush ceased. I circled the shack slowly. Each footstep raised dry dust, the smell sharp and metallic in my nose. The tapping continued. Sometimes it paused, then returned deliberate, echoing inside the empty walls. I crouched. Fingers traced cracks in the wooden frame. The black window seemed to absorb the faint glow of the stars, as if it had swallowed them whole. I could see nothing behind it, yet the tapping persisted, patient, measured, alive. I knelt by the window. The cold of the glass seeped through my fingertips, settling in my bones. I imagined a shape behind it, shadow folding into shadow, but nothing moved. Nothing breathed, only the tapping. A breeze lifted loose leaves and dust. The window remained black, perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the emptiness around it. Each tap pressed to my chest, a quiet rhythm that grew louder in my mind. I pressed my ear against the frame. The tapping vibrated through the wood, soft, hollow, repeating. I could feel it echoing along my bones, threading to the night air, through the dry grass, through the dust under my boots. Time slowed. I did not move, did not speak. The night held me still. The shack waited. The black windows stared back with no eyes, and the tapping continued, patient, quiet, deliberate. I reached toward the pane. Fingertips brushed the glass. It felt unnaturally smooth, cool, like the night itself pressed against it. The tapping stopped. Silence pressed in, heavier than before. I drew back slowly. The wind returned, rustling the brush, carrying the faint scent of dust and pine. I stepped away from the shack. The black window remained. No reflection, no light, only the echo of its tapping lingering in my ears, a memory pressed into the night. I walked back along the trail. Gravel whispered under my boots. The night seemed thinner, stretched tighter. I did not look back, yet I could feel the presence of that black window, patient, watching, waiting for another hand, another breath, another step into its silence. The highway stretched empty beneath a pale moon. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and dry grass. I followed the curve of the road to the rest stop. Alone, the parking lot was quiet. Vending machines hummed softly, though the cord were cut, dangling across the cracked concrete. A faint static vibrated through the cool night air. I stepped closer, boots crunching gravel, and the hum threaded through my chest. The building was small, square, utilitarian. The lights flickered dimly, casting shadows that clung to walls and corners. I approached the door. It was cold metal under my hand. A faint smell of bleach lingered, mingled with dust and something faintly metallic. I entered the restroom. Tiles underfoot were rough, slightly sticky from some old spill. Shadows pooled in the corners. I noticed movement, slow and unnatural. They gathered in the stalls, stretching upward, not down, as if gravity had reversed inside those cubicles. I froze. Breath pressed against my throat. The hum from the vending machines seemed to thrum in rhythm with my heartbeat. The shadows shifted without sound. Their edges blurred and stretched toward the ceiling, folding across tiles and plumbing, patient and deliberate. I stepped further inside. The air smelled faintly of cold water and mildew. Fingers brushed the sink. It was cool, rough beneath my palms. The shadows stretched higher. I imagined them brushing the ceiling, long, thin, swaying. They did not fall. They did not move down. The hum grew slightly louder, or perhaps my ears strained to it. A faint static threaded through the fluorescent flicker. The shadows quivered in response, stretching into corners and along walls, folding the room into itself. I moved toward a stall. The tiles creaked underfoot. Dust rose in tiny clouds. I imagined opening the door, but I did not. I could feel the shadow pressing from inside, stretching upward, patient, a silent presence pressing against the ceiling. The air pressed against my skin, cold patches along my arms. The faint metallic tang returned, mixing with the smell of tiles and water. The hum pulsed gently, threading along the walls, through the pipes, through my own chest. I stepped back toward the sink. The shadows in the stalls shifted slightly, leaning toward each other, stretching together into angles that felt impossible. They were patient, alive in their stillness. A soft breeze lifted dust along the floor. The fluorescent lights flickered. The hum persisted, threaded through the empty room. I breathed slowly, tasting the faint smell of metal and bleach, feeling the cool tile press against my palms. Time stretched. Minutes, hours, I cannot tell. The shadows remained in the stalls, reaching upward, stretching into corners, folding the small room into itself. I could hear only my own breathing and the hum of the machines. I turned toward the door. Each step raised tiny clouds of dust. The hum vibrated beneath my boots, threaded through the walls, folding into the shadows in the stalls. I did not look back, yet I felt their pull, patient and deliberate, stretching upward in the silence. Outside, the lot was quiet again. The vending machines hummed softly, their cords dangling in the still night. The air smelled of asphalt and dry grass. I pressed my hand to car door. The metal was cool. The night pressed close, and the shadows remained, folded into memory, stretching upward in the stalls of the abandoned restroom, patient, watching, waiting. The night was quiet. Stars scattered across a dark sky, pale and distant. The air smelled faintly of pine and dry earth, cool against my skin. I sat by the campfire. Flames licked the wood, orange and soft, casting shadows that flickered across the sand and rocks. The heat pressed gently against my legs. I whispered into the fire, a word, then a phrase, soft, casual, almost bored. The fire shifted. Its light danced differently. Then it whispered back. Every word I had spoken returned to me, slightly delayed, warmer, vibrating through the air. I froze. The wind stilled. The trees pressed close in the darkness. I whispered again. The fire repeated, soft, alive, folding my words into its own glow. Each echo pressed against my ears, threading through the heat, through the smell of smoke, through the dry brush around the campsite. I leaned closer. Fingers brushed the rough bark of nearby logs. The flames shimmered, twisting, not like normal fire. It mimicked me perfectly, my voice, my cadence, my hesitation. Beyond the circle of fire, the dark shifted. Shadows moved without sound, folding across rocks and trees, never fully forming, but never gone. I whispered a question. The fire paused briefly, then returned it, soft, deliberate, as if considering the shape of my words. A breeze lifted ashes. They spiraled into the air, carrying the faint smell of dry earth and smoke. I pressed my palms to the ground. Cool sand pressed against my fingers, grains shifting slightly. The fire's voice followed, threading into my own heartbeat. Shadows stretched farther into the night, elongated, patient, silent. I spoke again, slower this time. The flames returned every syllable. It was not loud, not harsh, but impossible to ignore. Something shifted beyond the edge of the circle. I could sense it, pressing closer, leaning in with patience. The fire flared. Warmth brushed my face. Ashes rose in lazy spirals, smelling faintly of pine and smoke. The voice echoed once more, matching my tone perfectly. I felt my pulse in my ears. I leaned back, tracing the cool night air with my fingers. The dark beyond the flames moved again. Not violently, not quickly, just a fold of shadow, a presence patient, aware. It shifted silently, matching the rhythm of the fire, waiting. I whispered a single word. The fire returned it, soft and deliberate. A bead of sweat traced my temple. The night pressed close, the cool air carrying the faint scent of soil and ash. The shadows beyond remained. They did not approach, did not recede. They simply observed, folding along the edges of the circle. I traced a finger along the ground. The sand was rough beneath my nails, cool and dry. The fire's voice repeated my motion in its own flicker. I could feel the heat along my arms, the pulse of the night around me. The wind stirred again. It lifted the faint smell of smoke and pine. Shadows shifted slightly, leaning into firelight, folding over themselves, never solid, never gone. I drew a slow breath, fingers brushing sand. The fire whispered back again, patient, mimicking, alive in a way I could not name. I did not speak further. I simply listened, feeling the warmth, feeling the night, feeling the subtle movement of darkness beyond the flames. The stars above seemed softer, pale light pressing across the desert. I leaned back fully. Sand pressed against my spine. The fire flickered gently, repeating nothing now, yet its warmth held the memory of my words, folding them into the shadows that linger beyond, patient, silent, watching. I closed my eyes. The night breathed with me. The fire whispered once more, then settled, warm and alive. The darkness beyond remained, still and patient, and I felt the edges of its presence, folding into the warmth, waiting. The highway stretched endlessly under a pale, silver moon. The desert pressing on either side, dry wind brushing across the hood of the car. The air smelled faintly of dust and asphalt, cool against my skin. I drove slowly. The tires whispered against the gravel shoulders. The hum of the engine pressed softly in my chest. The night felt vast, silent, but alive with something just beyond sight. Ahead, a shadow moved, tall, rigid, crossing the asphalt with a deliberate grace. My headlights fell across it. The light passed straight through. No body appeared, no solid shape, only the shadow remained. It stretched across the road, long and thin, folding into the desert beyond. I slowed. Air pressed against my face through the cracked window. The scent of dust mingled with the faint metallic tang of the car's interior. The shadow lingered, patient, pulling along the edges of the sand and rocks. I blinked. It shifted just slightly, leaning as if walking, yet weightless. The wind whispered along the highway, stirring loose gravel and dry leaves. The shadow stretched farther, elongated, unreal, folding into the horizon. I pressed my hand to the steering wheel. Leather was cool beneath my palm. The hum of the tires hummed through my bones. The shadow swayed with the rhythm of the wind, patient, alive in its stillness. It moved without sound, folding the air around it, stretching endlessly into the desert. I slowed further. The car's headlights scanned the asphalt. Nothing solid appeared, only the shadow that lingered. It bent across rocks and sand, a black ribbon moving without form. I could feel its presence pressing softly against the night. I stepped lightly on the brake. The tires whispered against the asphalt. The desert smelled faintly of sage and dry stone. The shadow did not retreat. It did not shift toward me. It simply remained, folding across the road, leaning into the moonlight. I rolled down the window. The air was cool, carrying the faint rustle of desert brush. The shadow stretched farther, longer than logic should allow. It pressed along the sand, leaning over itself, patient, deliberate, eternal. I drove slowly again. Each tire whispered against the asphalt. The shadow followed, folding over the road, pulling along the edges of my vision. The desert seemed thinner here. The night stretched tight, pressing against the car, against me. I blinked once more. It had not moved. Yet the shadow leaned farther into the horizon. Air shifted. The scent of dust and sand pressed in. The night hummed faintly in my ears. The figure was gone. Only the shadow remained, long, patient, watching. I continued along the road. Gravel whispered beneath the tires. The desert pressed quiet on all sides. Every so often, I glanced at the edges of the asphalt. The shadow lingered, folding across sand and rock, a black ribbon of memory stretching farther than I could follow. I eased the car forward. The wind stirred faintly, pressing dust along the edges of the highway. The shadow did not bend, did not falter. It simply stretched patient, pulling along the desert, leaning into the night. The moon pressed pale light across the horizon. I inhaled slowly. Cool air, dry and faintly metallic. The shadow remained, a silent presence pressing to memory, folding endlessly into the desert, haunting the night, patient, watching. I did not look back again. The tires whispered against the asphalt. The desert exhaled faintly. The highway stretched on, empty and silent. And the shadow lingered in my mind, folding endless, beyond the reach of headlights, beyond the reach of night. The desert road stretched pale under the moon. Sand drifted across the asphalt. Cool air pressing faintly against my skin. The scent of dry earth and distant sage lingered in the night. Ahead, a billboard rose from the sand. Faded, weathered, leaning slightly. Its frame creaked softly in the wind, and at its edge the figure sat, still, unmoving, black against the pale sky, its shape sharp against the moonlight. The shadow stretched long across the sand, folding like a second sign, leaning into the desert itself. I slowed the car. The tires whispered against gravel. The wind shifted. The smell of dust pressed against my nose, dry, metallic, faint. The figure did not move, did not breathe. I stepped out. Cool air pressed against my arms. Sand whispered underfoot. The shadow remained, stretching across the dunes, long, patient, deliberate. It leaned with gravity that did not bend. The billboard creaked again. A faint rustle in the frame. The figure's shadow shifted slightly. Not toward me, not away, but leaning, folding, stretching. Impossible angles pressed against the sand. I walked closer. Fingers brushed dry brush and gravel. The wind hummed softly. The desert smelled faintly of metal and stone. The figure remained still, its shadow a ribbon across the dunes, tugging the night along with it. I raised my eyes to the figure. It sat as though carved from the darkness itself. No eyes, no face, just the shape of something patient. The shadow stretched farther than logic allowed, folding into sand, a second sign, pressing against the night. I pressed a hand to the metal of the car. Cool, solid, real. The wind lifted faint grains of sand. The shadow shifted slightly with a breeze, folding, patient, deliberate. It pressed into the edges of the dunes, into the pale moonlight. I stepped back. The gravel whispered beneath my boots. The night hummed faintly, folding the desert around the figure. The shadow stretched, longer, thinner, folding into itself like smoke pressed into sand. I breathed slowly. The cool air carried the faint scent of dust and stone. The figure did not move. The shadow did not fade. It leaned patient, a presence pressed into the edges of the desert, watching without eyes. I turned to the car. Sand pressed against my shoes. The tires whispered against gravel. The wind shifted, pushing faint dust along the dunes. The figure remained, its shadow folded into the desert, patient, unmoving, pressing against memory. I climbed back into the car. The engine hummed softly. The desert stretched quiet on all sides. The billboard leaned slightly. The figure remained at its edge, its shadow stretching long into the sand, pressing into the night, folding, patient, watching. I did not look back again. The tires whispered along the asphalt. The desert exhaled faintly, pressing the night close. And the shadow lingered in my mind, folding across the sand, impossible and silent. A second sign left behind in the moonlight. The night pressed quietly over the desert. Cool air brushed against the windshield, carrying faint scents of dust and dry sage. The sky was pale with stars, distant and patient. The radio hummed softly. Static filled the cabin, a low vibration in my chest. I turned the dial. Crackling, rustling, whispers underneath. Faint, deliberate, coordinates, repeated over and over. Soft, almost melodic, threading through the static. The desert pressing around me. The tires whisper on the gravel, loose stones shifting with each inch. I followed the voices. They pulled me toward a tower, rusted and skeletal against the moonlight. Its metal frame groaned faintly in the wind. The smell of ozone and cold metal pressed against my nose. The static hummed louder. I reached out, touching the radio dial. The whispers repeated my movement. Cool air pressed through the cracked window. Shadows shifted along the rocks nearby, folding, stretching, impossible and patient. The coordinates ended at a trail. Dead end. The road crumbled into sand and stone. I stepped out. The gravel whispered beneath my boots. The air was dry, metallic, faintly warm from the day. The tower loomed above. Its frame stretched into stars. The static hummed through the car, pressing against my ribs. Beneath it, voices pulsed again, soft, deliberate, pulling me closer. I walked toward the trail. Cool sand pressed against my shoes. The rocks pressed their shadows into the desert. Each step echoed faintly, folding into the static. The air hummed with anticipation. The whispers guided me. Slowly, carefully, shadows shifted along the edges of the rocks, leaning, patient, folding with each step I took. I could feel the presence pressing lightly, just beyond the circle of the car's headlights. The trail ended abruptly. Sand and rock pressed against each other, forming a wall at the edge of the world. The tower groaned in the wind, metal singing faintly. The shadows pulsed, not with sound, not with movement, but with weight, Folding, pressing, deliberate. I stepped closer. Hand brushed against rough stone. Cool metal pressed faintly against my back. The whispers continued, threading through the static, folding the night into the desert. The shadows leaned farther into the rocks, pressing into angles that should not exist. I breathed slowly. Dust and faint ozone pressed against my nostrils. The tower hummed faintly in rhythm with the radio. The static pulsed with voices. Coordinates repeated, endless and patient. The shadows pressed against the rocks, leaning, folding, weightless yet present. I sank onto a boulder. Sand brushed my hands. Cool air pressed against my neck. The whispers hummed softly, threading through the radio, through the static, through the night itself. The shadows pulsed again, folding, pressing, patient. I leaned back, eyes tracing the tower. Its skeletal frame pressed against the stars, still eternal. The shadows had not moved closer, nor had they retreated. They pulsed in rhythm with the whispers, leaning into the edges of the desert, folding into the night. I did not speak. I did not move. Only the static hummed softly. The coordinates repeated, threading the night with patience, pulling the shadows along the rocks, folding, pressing, alive in a quiet, impossible way. I breathed in slowly. Cool, dry air filled my lungs. Sand brushed my fingers. The radio hummed. The tower pressed against the stars. Shadows leaned into the rocks. Everything waited, patient, folding into memory, folding into the night. I climbed back into the car. The static hummed faintly. The tires whispered against gravel. The desert stretched quiet and endless on all sides. And in my mind, the shadows pulsed. The whispers lingered. Coordinates repeated endlessly, folding the night, folding the desert, folding me into its patient rhythm. The desert stretched quiet under a silver moon. Sand pressed against the edges of the trail. Cool air brushed my arms, carrying a faint scent of dust and dry brush. Ahead, a shack stood alone, wooden and weathered, leaning slightly, walls intact, windows intact, but no door. The frame gaped open like a mouth. Empty, patient. I stepped closer. Gravel whispered under my boots. The air smelled faintly of old wood and sun-warmed stone. A soft hum pressed in the silence, like the desert itself was breathing. Inside, the floor was bare. Sunlight no longer reached here. Shadows shifted across the boards. Faint at first, then deliberate, like feet brushing against the floor, though no one stood within. I paused. The wind pressed faintly through the empty window frames. Dust stirred softly, tracing thin lines across the boards. The shadows leaned, folded, pressing into angles they shouldn't reach. The air felt heavier here, cool yet still, pressing against my chest. I crouched to examine the floor. No footprints, no marks, yet the shadows moved. They stretched and leaned toward the corners, folding patient, as if waiting for something unseen. A faint creak echoed, not from the shack, but from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Air pressed faintly in my ears. The shadows pressed closer to the walls, folding, impossible, deliberate. I touched the wood, cool and rough beneath my fingers. Dust whispered softly from the edges. The shadows pulsed lightly with each breath I drew, folding toward the empty center of the shack. I could feel the stillness pressing, weightless yet present, folding the air, the floor, the walls into quiet tension. I rose slowly. The wind shifted. A faint rustle moved along the window frame. The shadows stretched farther across the boards, leaning into corners, pressing, folding, patient. The shack remained empty. No one had entered. No one would leave. I stepped back. Gravel whispered beneath my boots. The desert smelled faintly of dust and stone. The shack seemed to exhale, pushing faint air across my face. The shadows pulsed, folding into each other, patient, unmoving, like memory pressed into wood. I reached the edge of the shack. The moon pressed pale light against the boards. Shadows clung to the empty corners. The air hummed faintly, pressing the night into the floor. The desert exhaled faintly, still and silent around me. I breathed slowly. The shack remained still, shadows leaning, folding, pressing against the emptiness. No door, no entry, no exit. I did not look inside again. Sand brushed against my shoes. The desert pressed quiet. The shack stood alone, patient. The shadows lingered across the boards, folding into the night, unmoving, yet somehow alive. I walked back to the trail. Gravel whispered beneath my boots. Cool air pressed faintly against my skin. The shack faded behind me. Its shadows folded into memory, pressing quietly into the night, waiting, patient, silent. The desert lay still beneath a moon-washed pale. Cool wind brushed my neck, carrying dry dust and faint sage. Gravel whispered beneath my boots as I walked the empty road. A sudden ring pierced the quiet, metallic, sharp, impossible against the silence. I froze. A phone booth, rusted, forgotten, stood alone in the sand. Its glass panes reflected moonlight, fractured and soft. I stepped closer. Sand pressed faintly against my shoes. The air smelled faintly of ozone and old metal. The receiver lifted itself, trembling slightly. I held my breath. A voice came, soft, slithering under the hum of the desert. "Look behind you," it whispered. The words pressed against my ears, slow, deliberate. The static of the booth hummed faintly, vibrating through my chest. I turned. Empty desert. No booth. Nothing. Just sand and night, and the wind brushing faintly over the stones. The silence pressed in. Cool air wrapped around me, still and heavy. The desert smelled of dust, dry and patient. The faint hum lingered in my ears, as if the booth had left a shadow behind. I took a cautious step forward. Gravel whispered underfoot. The moon glinted against rocks. Wind pressed against my cheeks. Every sense taut, aware, pulling the night closer to me. The booth reappeared. Not behind me, not ahead. It shimmered faintly in the distance, edges soft, unreal. The receiver lifted again. The static hummed softly, pressing the night into my chest. I approached slowly. Sand brushed between my fingers as I reached for the cold metal. The voice whispered again, faintly, threads of sound weaving through the static. I leaned closer, feeling the desert press around me, cool air and dust folding into silence. "Look behind you," it whispered again. The words stretched into the night. I turned, and again nothing. No booth, no shadow, just sand and stars, patient and empty. I stepped back, heart pressing faintly against ribs. The booth shimmered at the corner of my vision. Faint hum threaded through the air. Dust stirred softly across the desert floor. Shadows shifted with impossible angles, folding into themselves. The desert felt alive, not with wind, not with animals, but with a weight pressing softly, pulling air and sound into a single breath. The booth remained, gone, then present again, a flicker at the edge of perception, patient and quiet. I reached for the receiver. It felt cold, vibrating faintly. The voice whispered slowly, deliberate, "Look behind you." I breathed in the desert, dust brushing my face, sand pressing lightly against shoes. The booth pulsed faintly with each whisper. I dared to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The horizon lay empty, patient, still. The moon glinted pale over sand and stone. The booth vanished once more, and the hum lingered, threading through the desert, folding the night around me. I stepped back from where it had been. Gravel whispered faintly beneath my boots. Cool air pressed against my cheeks. Dust stirred softly across the rocks. Shadows leaned patient, folding into the angles of the desert floor. The booth was gone, but the whispers remained, soft, metallic, patient, pressed into my ears, my chest. Threading through the still night, the desert held its breath. I walked slowly. Sand brushed my shoes. Gravel whispered faintly underfoot. Cool wind pressed against my skin, and somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the booth pulsed faintly, gone yet present, its voice lingering patient, folding the night into memory. I did not look back again. The desert stretched quiet, empty, vast. The moon pressed pale light against sand and stone. Shadows leaned into angles they should not have reached. The voice whispered faintly in my mind, soft, metallic, impossible, folding the desert, folding me into the quiet weight of night. The desert stretched endless beneath a pale moon. Sand pressed softly beneath my boots. A cool wind whispered across rocks and cactus, carrying dry dust and the faint scent of sun-warmed stone. I followed the trail. Gravel whispered beneath each step. The shadows of cacti leaned toward me, folding into the shapes they should not have reached. The air felt heavy, patient, pressing faintly against my chest. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to curl in on itself, folding into the trail, folding me into the sand. The rocks repeated, the same shapes, the same angles, casting shadows that mirrored themselves across the path. I paused. Breath came shallow and faint. A cactus leaned impossibly, its shadow pressing across the sand. I looked behind me. Footprints faded into nothing. The sand swallowed them softly, pressing quiet over memory. The trail curved again. I thought I recognized a rock. Then another step revealed it to be the same as before. The same shadows, folding over themselves, leaning against the sand. The trail looped endlessly. I walked and walked, and each turn brought the same shapes, the same desert, the same quiet weight of air. A hum pressed faintly against my ears. Not wind, not rock, a soft vibration, threading through the sand, through my boots, through the air around me. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, folding into corners they should not have touched. I knelt to touch the sand, cool and fine between my fingers. The footprints behind me had vanished completely. No imprint remained, no evidence of passage. Only the trail ahead, looping, patient, pressing the night into my chest. I walked on. The desert smelled faintly of dry sage and stone. The wind pressed faintly against my cheeks. Shadows leaned across the trail, stretching, folding, always in the same impossible angles. The moon pressed pale light over everything, and still the trail curved, endless, infinite. I stopped again. Gravel whispered beneath my boots. The cacti leaned into the same spots. The same rocks rose, jagged and silent. I blinked. The trail behind me had erased itself. Even my own passage could not remain. A soft rustle brushed my arm. The air pressed faintly against my neck. Shadows flickered at the edge of the moonlight, folding closer, then receding into themselves. I could feel the desert pressing, cool and patient, folding the night over me. I tried to mark the trail. A stone moved beneath my fingers. I turned again. The same rock, the same cactus, the same shadows leaning into impossible shapes. The trail looped again. I walked. The moon watched, pale and still. The desert pressed, patient and unyielding. I felt my breath in the silence. Rustling sand at my feet. Shadows stretched to the edges of the trail, folding into shapes that mirrored themselves. Time pressed faintly against my chest, pressing the desert into a single, quiet loop. I paused. The wind whispered softly over sand. The trail curved before me. I blinked. The footprint behind me had vanished. No evidence of passage. Only the trail ahead, folding, pressing, looping, and the shadows pressed gently at the edges of the moonlight, folding into themselves, patient, eternal. I walked again. Sand whispered beneath my boots. Air pressed cool and still against my skin. The cacti leaned, shadows folding, pressing faintly into the trail. The rocks repeated endlessly. The trail looped on, and I walked. I stopped, chest pressing faintly with the weight of silence. The desert hummed softly beneath the moonlight. Shadows leaned toward the path, patient. The trail curved once more, folding into itself infinite. Footprints behind me vanished. The desert pressed, endless, and I walked, alone, into the loop. The wind brushed against my face. The sand whispered. The moon pressed pale light over the endless trail. Shadows leaned, folding into themselves, pressing against the desert, patient, watching me walk and walk and walk. The dunes stretched, pale under a restless moon. Sand slipped softly beneath my boots, cool, grainy, whispering beneath each step. The air pressed close, humming faintly, like electricity pulsing through invisible wires. I paused, breath shallow, feeling the static prickling along my arms. The night smelled of dry stone and wind-heated sand, and something else, something metallic, faint, pressing against my senses. Higher now. Each rise brought a sharper wind. It tugged at my clothes, tugged at my hair, and carried that low, vibrating hum. The dunes rolled endlessly around me, shadows pooling at their bases, shifting, never still, but never moving toward me either. I climbed, sand slipping beneath my weight, listening to the hum grow stronger, thickening, pressing into my ears. Stars above flickered, not like clouds, not like wind-blurred light, but like a screen-losing signal, blinking on and off in quiet static. I stopped at the peak, breath fogged in the cool air. The hum pressed softly against my chest, against my bones, and I felt the faint vibration through the sand itself. Shadows rose, not from rocks, not from dunes, but from the sand itself, stretching, folding upward toward the flickering stars. I blinked, and they shivered, dissolving slightly, then rising again. The hum whispered around me, soft and insistent. Each gust of wind carried a faint metallic tang and a subtle vibration in my fingertips. The sand beneath me shifted, shadows sliding over its surface like the desert itself was breathing. I took a step forward. The air prickled, fine electricity dancing along my skin. The shadows rose higher, edges blurred, folding toward the faint light of the moon. Stars flickered again, as if winking, as if something beyond them had noticed me. I crouched, hand brushing the sand. Cool grain sifted through my fingers, and the shadows reached closer. Not threatening, but present, watching, patient. The hum grew, deeper now, layered, like static layered over static, over something darker, quieter. It wrapped around me, pressing faintly against my chest, against the backs of my eyes. I breathed slowly. The stars pulsed faintly, their light dimming in patterns, a silent rhythm I could not name. The shadows rippled across the dunes, stretching toward the faint, flickering constellations, then folding back into the sand. I stood again. The wind tugged at my sleeves, and the sand underfoot whispered softly. The hum vibrated in my chest, in the soles of my boots, through the air around me, like the desert itself had grown aware. I turned slowly, expecting to see a horizon empty of movement, but shadows rose there too, folding from the bases of distant dunes, leaning toward me in quiet, patient arcs. I could feel them reaching, stretching, toward the stars above, toward the faint, static flicker of light. I whispered softly to the night, a wordless sound against the hum, and the shadows shivered, folding slightly, then rising again as though listening. The desert smelled faintly of hot stone, dry wind, and a subtle metallic tang that lingered in the back of my throat. I sat, knees drawn close, sand pressing faintly against my skin, the hum vibrating softly through the air. Shadows folded and unfolded, rising and falling, never reaching fully, never vanishing entirely. The stars flickered above, pulsing, folding light into darkness, then back again. Time slowed. The desert pressed around me, patient, alive, the hum vibrating against my chest, through my bones, through the sand itself. Shadows rose once more, folding upward in quiet arcs, and I breathed slowly, listening. The wind whispered over the dunes. The sand sifted beneath my hands. Stars flickered faintly above, and the hum pressed softly, insistent, patient, eternal. Shadows folded. Shadows rose. The desert waited. I closed my eyes. Fingers pressed into the cool sand. The hum vibrated through everything. The stars pulsed in quiet static. Shadows reached, folded, stretched patiently, and I sat still in the endless hush of the dunes. The town lay empty. Dust swirled across cracked boards and rusted signs. The air smelled of dry stone and silence. Even the wind seemed hesitant, moving softly over broken glass and abandoned homes. At the center, the well waited, stone edges worn smooth by time, its mouth dark, endless. I knelt beside it, feeling the rough stone under my fingers, cool and slightly damp from shadowed nights. I dropped a rock. It slipped past my fingers. The stone fell and fell. No sound, no echo, not even a whisper of contact. The emptiness swallowed it instantly. I pressed my ear near the opening. The darkness stared back, cold, patient, unyielding. A faint chill crept up my arms. I drew back, shivering slightly, and the wind brushed against my neck, soft and empty. The sun dipped lower. Shadows lengthened across the ghost town. Windows stared like hollow eyes. Doors sagged on their hinges, and the well remained dark and quiet, holding its secret. Night fell. The desert sky turned pale, dotted with stars. A soft hum of the distant wind moved through broken buildings. I could smell dry stone, dust, and a faint metallic tang, like the earth itself had a taste. The well yawned below me. Shadows shifted in the corners of the town, stretching slowly toward the dark stone mouth. I stepped back, heart slow but aware. Figures began to emerge from the edges of the ruins. Shadows first, long, thin, moving quietly across the sand. They gathered at the well, peering downward, body still but present, as if waiting. The air chilled further. My breath misted faintly before me. The shadows didn't speak. They didn't move abruptly, but I could feel their attention, heavy, patient, and cold. Each rustle of sand beneath their feet whispered softly, like a warning in a language I almost knew. I dropped another stone. It vanished silently. Even the small sound of displacement was swallowed. The shadows leaned just slightly, elongated forms reaching without moving closer. Eyes. I thought I saw their eyes glinting faintly, reflecting moonlight in tiny slivers, tiny mirrors on empty faces. I stepped closer. Stone edges pressed into my palms. Cool, rough, unyielding. The wind carried a faint scent. Burnt wood, dust, and something darker, like earth waiting beneath the surface. The shadows shivered together, as if stirred by the cold air, but not by movement. I knelt again, staring into the abyss. The black seemed thicker here, as if swallowing moonlight and memory. The desert hummed quietly. Even the stars above dimmed faintly, like they, too, knew not to intrude. A soft sound tapped from within the well. I froze. It was faint, deliberate, or perhaps my mind imagining a pulse in the dark. The shadows leaned closer, almost imperceptibly, heads tilting in unison, waiting. Patient, cold, silent. I took a deep breath, felt the rough stone, the sand under my knees, the hum of the empty town pressing softly in my ears. Nothing moved abruptly. Nothing breathed but me. And still, the shadows watched, their presence bending toward the well, edges dissolving into darkness and moonlight alike. I tried to pull away, slowly, sand shifting beneath my hands. The well remained. The shadows remained. The cold pressed in through the gaps in my sleeves. I could hear faint scraping, shoes, claws, or maybe nothing at all, against stone, against sand. The wind sighed over the town. The stars blinked faintly. The well yawned. I could feel it, pulling, patient, unending. A quiet hunger that waited, not for sound, not for movement, but for me. I rose to my feet, back away from the edge. Shadows still lingered, gathering near the black stone mouth, silent, patient, eternal. The air smelled of dust, stone, and the faint trace of metal again. Cold pressed against my skin. The night whispered, and the well remained. Silent, endless, waiting. The highway stretched empty. Night pressing on both sides. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and dust, dry and sharp. I could feel it cling to my skin, cool under the hum of the car heater. I glanced in the rear-view mirror. A pair of headlights shimmered in the distance, soft and pale. They hovered there, steady, then nothing, empty black. The road behind me reflected only my own tired face. I blinked. The lights reappeared briefly, a flicker against the darkness, and then vanished again. No trace, no glow, just the night itself. A subtle vibration hummed beneath my hands on the wheel. I tried to tell myself it was the engine, tires on old asphalt, but my gut said otherwise. Minutes passed. The desert stretched, silent and low. Stars pale above, scattered like salt. The radio murmured static, soft, meaningless whispers that faded when I turned my head. The heater hummed beneath me. The air smelled of metal and old leather. Then I noticed it, a shadow, dark on the road behind me. No headlights, no reflection, a car-shaped darkness, sliding perfectly in line with mine. I turned my eyes quickly to the mirror. Nothing. A heartbeat later, the shadow returned. Closer now, matching every curve of the road. I gripped the wheel tighter. The cold prickled along my neck and arms. A sense of presence pressing from behind. I slowed slightly. The shadow followed. I sped up. The shadow followed. Not a sound. Not a headlight. Just black, impossibly precise, relentless. The road twisted through small rises. Dust kicked from rocks scattered in the wind. I could hear the sand shifting softly beneath the tires. My breath came shallow. I tried to focus on the hum of the heater, the muted glow of the dashboard, anything to anchor me to reality, but the shadow moved with me. It mimicked every swerve, every hesitant curve. I could feel it there, patient, waiting, a dark weight pressing just beyond the mirror. I blinked again. Stars reflected faintly on the windshield. A cloud passed. The shadow seemed darker, closer, its edges sharper in the dim light. I dared to glance behind the car. The road was empty, only the asphalt, stretching to nothing, but the shadow remained. Impossibly perfect, a mirror of the vehicle I drove, silent, eternal. My hands shook. The wheel felt cold, metal and leather beneath my palms, vibrating faintly as if sensing the darkness. Every breath sounded too loud in the quiet. Every heartbeat echoed against the thin walls of the car. I turned on the radio. Static hissed, whispering faint coordinates, or maybe words I couldn't understand. The shadow did not react. It needed no sound, no signal. It followed, unyielding. I tried pulling over. Desert stretched empty on either side. No shoulder, no light, only shadow and sand. I stopped, hoped it would pass. The shadow waited. The black mass lingered behind me, not moving forward, not retreating, patient, alive, a presence that belonged neither to road nor night. I started again, slowly. Every mile felt measured, every movement mirrored. I glanced briefly in the mirror, closer, always there. The desert hummed around me. Wind pushed across rocks and dry brush. A faint smell of ozone, or maybe just fear. I dared not look again, but I could feel it. A silent weight in the road behind, following, relentless, eternal. I kept driving. The shadow did not leave, and the night did not end. Only road, my car, and the darkness that tracked me perfectly, silently, patiently, forever behind. The sand stretched endless, cool beneath my boots, shifting softly as I walked. Wind drifted over the dunes, carrying the sharp scent of dry earth. Night settled in, pale light from the stars, tracing the edges of rocks and cacti. Silence hummed around me, thick and heavy. I noticed it then, half buried in the sand. A mirror, framed in warped wood, tilted unevenly toward the sky. I stepped closer. The edges were warm, though the night air was cold. The grain of the desert whispered under my fingers. I looked into it. The sky reflected perfectly. Stars scattered across black, like spilled salt. But I was not there. I tilted my head. The sand behind me, the faint outline of my body, nothing. In its place, shadows moved. Slow, deliberate, impossible. They didn't match anything around them, yet they shifted as though alive. I knelt. The wind pressed against my face. Each grain of sand felt sharp, biting. The shadows stretched and recoiled, mimicking gestures I had never made. Fingers reached toward the glass from nowhere, curling as though waiting. I breathed slowly. The air tasted faintly metallic. I stepped back. The mirror remained, silent, unmoving. Yet the shadows continued. They bent with the dunes. They flickered across the sand beyond the frame, not quite connected to anything solid, not quite separate. A hum rose faintly, a vibration in my chest. Static prickled along my arms, along the back of my neck. It was the desert or something in the mirror, or maybe both. I couldn't tell. The shadows, though, they seemed to lean closer, as if the glass breathed along with them. I crouched again, close to the frame. The stars above flickered. The air smelled faintly of ozone or maybe burning wood. I reached out my hand. The mirror reflected only sand and sky. Not me, not the wind brushing across my skin. A shadow twitched. I froze. It was subtle, a slight bend where no figure stood. The sand around it stayed perfectly still, but the shadow moved. Small, deliberate gestures, like it was studying me. I leaned closer. The desert's quiet pressed against my ears. Every grain of sand whispered beneath my shoes. The frame of the mirror was rough against my fingertips, splintering softly. The shadow rose taller, bending impossibly across the stars. It mimicked the motion of a wave, though no breeze touched it. I stumbled back. My heart thudded in the hollow air. Breath shallow, visible in the cold. The mirror stayed where it was. The stars above reflected perfectly, but the space below them trembled with movement. Shapes and limbs that had no owner. I circled it, every angle the same. The desert reflected, the sky reflected. But me, never me. Only shadows that twisted and leaned. Shadows that moved when the wind did not. Shadows that seemed to whisper without sound. I crouched again, unable to look away. The sand tickled against my palms. A faint hum vibrated the soles of my boots. The shadows stretched across the dunes, echoing shapes I had never made. A pulse of cold ran through my chest. I wanted to run. I could not. Time blurred. Stars shifted subtly. Wind whispered softly through distant rocks, and still the shadows moved. They leaned, reaching, folding into one another, as if alive inside the glass, yet also spilling beyond it into the desert. I dared to whisper. The air swallowed it. No echo, no reflection in the glass. Only the shadows, moving in silent rhythm. Shapes that studied, shapes that waited, shapes that had nothing to do with me, yet touched the space I occupied. The night deepened. The hum beneath the dunes rose, then fell. I stood, my fingers brushing the warped wood. The mirror remained half buried, silent. Stars scattered across its surface, and the shadows did not rest. I stepped back. The desert stretched empty beyond the glass. Sand shifted faintly under my boots. The wind whispered. The shadows paused, then leaned again, reaching toward the mirror's edges, leaning toward where I might have been. I did not look again. I left the mirror behind, half buried in sand. The desert stretched, silent and endless. Yet when I glanced once more over my shoulder, I thought I saw shapes moving in the distance, leaning slowly toward the place where the mirror waited, watching, and I knew it would not reflect me. Not tonight, not ever. The horizon stretched endlessly. Sand rolled beneath my boots. Cold night air pressed against my skin. Stars flickered weakly, pale light spilling across the dunes. I walked. In the distance, a faint glow appeared. A house. Windows aglow with soft, trembling light. I quickened my steps. The hum of the desert followed me, subtle, vibrating under my feet. The house shifted, not in shape, not in structure. It receded, further along the horizon, no matter how fast I walked. The glow stayed the same distance away. The wind rustled dry grass at my ankles, but it carried no scent of smoke, no warmth of life. I paused. My breath came shallow. The sand hissed faintly beneath my boots. I felt a pull, a quiet insistence to reach the house. Soft footsteps echoed behind me. But when I turned, only emptiness stared back. I walked again. The glow flickered, pale as a dying ember. Shadows leaned toward me across the dunes, elongated and impossible, moving contrary to the moon. I reached out with a trembling hand. The light didn't grow closer. It stayed just beyond reach. I tried to call. My voice swallowed instantly by the desert. Nothing answered. Nothing moved. Only the hum beneath my boots and the whispering wind. Hours passed. I could not tell. Time lost meaning. The house, it seemed to mock me. Step by step, it moved with the horizon, soft light bouncing faintly in a rhythm I could not follow. I sat on a dune. The air tasted of dust and cold metal. My fingers dug into sand, gritty and sharp. I traced a line behind me. Footprints. They looped strangely. The path behind me curved as though I had walked in circles. But I had felt forward, always forward. The wind lifted grains against my face. I blinked. The house's glow shimmered farther still. Shadows moved over the dunes. Long, unnatural arcs across the sand. I felt them watching. Or perhaps I only felt their absence. I rose, steps faltering. The horizon stretched impossibly wide. The soft light of the house pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat I could not reach. The air smelled faintly of ozone. Static prickled along my arms, the hairs on my neck standing. I walked again. The dunes repeated themselves. Cactus, stone-cracked earth, all familiar. All wrong. The desert spun slowly beneath the stars. I whispered into the night. The light did not answer. Yet the hum beneath my boots rose, vibrating through my chest. Shadows leaned closer, silent, patient, their angles shifting against the dunes. Not quite my own, not quite the desert's. I stumbled. The air was thick, pressing against my lungs. The house remained, always distant, always unreachable. Dawn arrived slowly. The horizon blushed with pale orange. I paused. The house remained, the glow still faint, now tinged with early light. I looked down at the sand. Footprints looped back toward themselves. I had walked in circles all night, around the same dunes, around the same shadows. I could hear the faint wind, rustling dry grass and shifting sand. The hum beneath my boots had not stopped. The house, now dim under dawn's light, stayed at the horizon, waiting, silent, endless. I sat on the sand. The cold pressed through my clothes. The glow faded slowly as the sun rose. Yet I knew it would return tonight. I would walk again, step by step, circling the same desert, chasing the same horizon. Alone, the stars vanished. The light softened. Shadows receded slightly, stretching across the dunes in quiet protest. I closed my eyes. The wind brushed my face. The desert waited. The house waited. I waited with it. And the horizon never ended. The desert was still. The air pressed heavy and warm against my skin. Stars hung faint, pale, distant. I lay on the sand, my back sinking into soft ridges and tiny stones. The wind whispered gently, brushing grains across my arms. But beneath it, another sound stirred, a subtle vibration, low, almost imperceptible. The ground beneath me hummed faintly. I held my breath. The sand felt alive, cold in places I hadn't expected, shifting slightly as if breathing. Whispers rose, soft, indistinct, like voices murmuring underwater. I could not understand them, yet the cadence that drew my attention tugged at the edges of thought. Shadows moved across the dunes, not by the wind, not cast by the stars. They rippled, subtle arcs across the sand, stretching, recoiling, stretching again. I felt eyes, something observing beneath the surface. My fingers pressed into sand. The grains trembled beneath my touch. A low hum pulsed through my bones. I pulled back slowly. The whispers grew, closer, as if the desert itself was speaking my name, or maybe laughing softly at my stillness. I sat up. The sand shimmered faintly under starlight. Patterns shifted. Footprints I had left earlier seemed blurred, like water washing over stone. The air smelled of ozone and dry clay. I pressed my palm to the earth. The vibrations were stronger there, throbbing slowly, in a rhythm I could almost follow. I whispered into the night. Nothing answered, except the whispers beneath me, a chorus of something ancient, something patient. I felt a movement beneath the dunes, not through the sand surface. Beneath it, a subtle pulse, soft but deliberate. The shadows on the slopes bent toward me, lengthening into shapes I could not name. My heartbeat quickened, yet I could not move. The desert held me there, feet sinking into grains that trembled, like the earth itself was aware of my presence. I rolled onto my side. The wind carried a faint static, electric and cold against my skin. A thin layer of frost touched my cheek, though the night had been warm. The whispers grew louder, rhythmic now. They formed words I could almost recognize, half memories of voices I had never heard. Stay, wait, or maybe it was only the echo of my imagination. The dunes around me rippled, slowly, methodically, a wave passing under the sand, lifting shadow after shadow in gentle, impossible arcs. I felt small, insignificant. I tried to rise. The sand pulled back subtly, as though resisting. My knees sank. My palms felt the tremor beneath, and for a moment I imagined hands beneath the grains, pushing, pulling, unseen. The stars flickered. A pulse of dim light danced along the horizon. The whispers reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. Silence pressed down, thick and heavy. Even the wind had fallen still. I lay back, exhausted, trembling. The sand beneath me cooled. Shadows settled in unnatural folds along the dunes. I felt watched, yet I could see nothing. Time stretched. The desert seemed endless, a living, breathing thing beneath the veneer of stillness. I closed my eyes. Hearing became sharper. The faintest heartbeat, pulsing below the surface, matching the rhythm of my own breath. The whispers returned, fainter now, like a tide pulling back into unseen caverns. The shadows flattened, merging with the dunes. I stayed still, listening, feeling the vibration under my hands and knees. The earth hummed a low, steady note, a lullaby both comforting and terrifying. I could not sleep. I could not move. The desert had claimed the night. The whispers beneath the sand, they waited. The first glimmer of dawn touched the horizon. The dunes softened in pale light. The tremors faded. The whispers receded. Yet I knew they were still there, waiting, beneath the sand, patient, endless. I rose slowly. The sand no longer shifted under me, but the desert kept its secrets, and I walked, feeling the pulse beneath each step, knowing it would follow me always. The first light stretched across the desert, pale, almost timid. It brushed the jagged rocks and softened the dunes. The shadows had begun to retreat, folding back into the cracks and crevices. I could feel the chill of night clinging to my skin. The air smelled faintly of dust and dry stone. Every breath was shallow, tentative, as if I might disturb the quiet. The trail ahead twisted between boulders, worn smooth by unseen travelers. Each step I took raised tiny clouds of sand, which settled slowly back into the earth's embrace. Most of the shadows had disappeared, but one lingered, taller than the rest, unmoving, patient. I stopped. The air felt thicker here, heavy with the residue of something unseen. The shadow did not bend or sway with the wind. It remained, stretching upward, a black shape against the soft dawn. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, a trick of light, a lingering shape cast by a nearby rock. But the feeling it pressed against my chest, slow and insistent, as if the shadow knew I was watching. I moved forward. Sand crunched beneath my feet. A dry hum pulsed faintly from the earth, or maybe from my own heartbeat. The shadow did not fade. It followed at the trail's end, unmoving yet advancing. I stopped again. Breath caught. The desert held its silence. A breeze stirred. It carried the scent of baked stone, faintly acrid, and the whisper of loose sand brushing against itself. The shadow remained, taller than any rock, its form rigid, unwavering. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to run, but my legs felt weighed down, tethered to the trail. And something in the distance, something patient, did not let me leave. The horizon shifted slightly as the sun rose. Colors bloomed across the dunes, soft gold and muted rose. The shadows folded into the landscape, all except one. It lingered, watching, waiting. I realized then, it wasn't leaving. It had never left. It followed me through every step, every quiet moment, through every restless night, an endless dune. The rocks ahead jutted like broken teeth. The shadow leaned near one, its form taller than anything natural. The heat of the sun began to touch my arms, but the shadow did not waver. Cool and dark, it held its place in defiance of dawn. I tried to speak. Words caught in my throat. Even whispers seemed swallowed by the desert's expanse. The sand beneath my feet shifted slightly, soft murmurs of grains brushing together, as if the earth itself acknowledged the presence behind me. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, careful. The shadow mirrored my path, never stretching ahead, never lagging behind, simply following. A faint hum rose from the rocks, low and resonant, vibrating against my ribs. I swallowed hard. The desert felt alive in a way I had never understood. It held me, and it waited. The wind picked up, rustling the edges of my shirt, stirring loose sand in pale spirals. The shadow did not move with it. It remained solid, eternal, watching. I stopped at the trail's end. The sun's warmth pressed against my back. The shadow loomed before me, immovable, patient, waiting. I looked away, thinking of turning back, but the desert offered no relief. The path behind me seemed empty, silent, yet the shadow was still there. I crouched briefly, hand touching the warm stone of the trail. The vibration beneath my palm was subtle, like a pulse from the earth itself. The shadow did not flicker, did not falter. It waited. I exhaled slowly, almost releasing the tension in my chest. But the weight of the shadow pressed down, a presence I could feel in the heat and the stillness. Dawn deepened. Colors softened further into pink and gold. The desert sighed, vast and indifferent. But the shadow remained tall and patient, its silence louder than any sound. I stood, no fight left in me, no more steps to take. The desert had claimed the night, and the shadow had claimed me. I turned my face to the sun, feeling warmth on my cheeks and the dust in my hair. The shadow lingered, watching, following, and I knew in that quiet, trembling moment that it would never leave. I would walk, I would breathe, and it would be there, always,